my great pleasure to welcome Peter Murmann. Shouldn't need much of an introduction because his work in business and management is very, very well known, including a number of classic case studies and other contributions in that field. And Peter's always put forward evolutionary ideas of some kind. We can talk about what those ideas are. So it's very, very relevant for this seminar. Peter, welcome. We're looking forward to your talk. Have you got slides to put up, or you?
Yep.
All right. Hopefully they will work.
Are you seeing my slides now?
I'm seeing your slides. That's fantastic, and hearing you well. Thank you. Please continue.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me. So I thought I would going to talk about evolutionary theory and strategic management, which I've been worrying about for 3 decades. Here is a quick outline of what I'm going to do. I will first tell you what my take is on the question, what are actually the key questions of strategic management, because I think this will set the stage for what I'm going to do afterwards. And then I will talk more broadly what explains well-adapted firms. And then I'm going to give you some evidence for variation selection and retention processes in industrial success. So I'm going to show you a broad array of different pieces of evidence that I and others have assembled over the years. And then hopefully I have some time to talk about more recent work that I've been doing on trying to measure foresight on the part of strategists or strategic teams. So to set the stage, what are the key questions in strategic management? As an academic field, the key question is, why do organizations differ in their performance? And when you think about practice, everybody who is trying to strategize for firms or act as a consultants to firms, the big practical question is, how do we create sustainable competitive advantage? And here you see many, many of the textbooks that try to help with this. In terms of the academic fields, as many of you know, I've spent 20 years in the US. And when I was a doctoral student and when I taught, we very much taught the idea that the way you measure performance is actually focused on money. And of course, in recent years, this has been challenged quite rightly. And nowadays, as a broader view, you can think of this as a triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. So there are multiple dimensions upon which you can assess strategic success. But I just want to highlight for you that, in the US, when you looked at a strategy course, most people implicitly assume that profits was the measure for this. So I also want to lay out what I think are the 2 main rival explanations for what explains well-adapted firms. And I want to start with a little bit of background. As some of you know, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that, I've been a doctoral student of Richard Nelson. I also have been inspired a great deal by Sid Winter. So I just wanted to say this because I'm not citing their books later on in my talk. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that they have been inspirations to me. And as an important piece of background information, I think it's useful to recall that evolutionary theories in economics, Nelson and Winter and others, and strategic management are reactions against the theoretical fiction of all-knowing agents in economic theory, and I think most of you would know this one, but also in terms of strategic management, they are a reaction to the popular fictions of superhero CEOs in management. If you will, the entire premise of most of our strategy courses is to say, you come and take our course, and after you've taken our course, ideally you can create a sustainable competitive advantage. And I think that suggestion is highly problematic. In fact, from my point of view, you need to establish that the CEOs were really behind his success and not sheer luck. And I'm going to talk about this in some moments. So this heroic version of success goes in the following way. So based on my early work in the dye industry here, I'm laying out three types of firm: a standard firm that doesn't do any R&D, then the second type of firm that is a firm with informal R&D. These would be production chemists who also inside try to develop new products. And then the third category, firms with formal R&D. They have an R&D department where people do nothing else but spend their entire day on trying to come up with new products and services. And if you believe in this heroic version, why is this not? You think about a population of firms at time t0. Here we have a standard firm, which is yellow. Of course, it realizes the competitive nature of the market has shifted, and if you want to be successful, you got to do formal R&D. Why formal R&D? Because then you develop products which are innovative. They are more in demand, and they can also have a higher quality, so you can charge higher prices, and this is why you want to do this. So you're switching from being a standard firm, and you adapt your firm to also have a formal R&D laboratory, and in time T2, you do this. The firm which already has been doing formal R&D realized, my God, this is a great thing to do. Let's hire more R&D workers, and they're doing even better, and so they are growing. And finally, the firm with informal R&D realizes, look, this is also another way to really do well, and so let's also transform ourselves. And so in this view, you get changes at the population level. And of course, I've simplified this here, but I've given you three types of firm. And every agent in the industry realizes to be successful in time T2, you've got to change yourself, and you're changing yourself and adopting the strategy of formal R&D. So the fiction of the superhero CEO says CEOs can easily see what strategy they need to do, and there are no challenges in implementing this. Now, if you don't know this study, but if you want to see a very detailed case study of a firm, in this case, it's Smith Corona, that was faced with a threat from electronic typewriters, which they still mastered, so they turned themselves to also producing electronic typewriters, but then came word processors and computers. They also actually tried to do a computer, but they failed. They could not compete with the new computer software and PC firms, and they went bankrupt. So if you want to get a sense of how hard and how many attempts firms do to adapt themselves, this is a beautiful case study. It's one of the most compelling case studies that I've seen. But the firm still fails, which means that this heroic version of how we're going to get change at the population level, that the CEOs just implement the correct changes, this is super hard. Then, of course, there is the alternative explanation for why firms are successful, and this is the evolutionary selection process. And so if I tell this story, again, we have the three types of firms. So I start with the population in the beginning, which is mainly standard firms, a few informal R&D firms, and only one firm that does formal R&D. Then we have a selection process, selection filter. Here I try to represent that some firms have an easier time getting through that filter by making the gap for the blue firms wider. And you see, as a yellow firm, you can get still through filter, but the firms with informal R&D get squeezed out. So what we see at time T2, we only have firms left that either do formal R&D or are standard firms which don't do anything because they focus on efficiency. So that would be a selection argument. And now the big question, I want to raise this at the beginning, and I don't think that there has been sufficient amount of attention given to this question. So I now laid out two alternative theoretical accounts of how we get change at the population level. The one through individual adaptation of the firms, or through a selection process where firms are weeded out. And I think what we haven't done, or at least I have not seen anybody who tried to quantify this, or even qualitatively say to what extent, when we are observing industries at very different times, to what extent this the industries have changed because of adaptation or selection process? So is the relative role of these two causal mechanism 50-50? Is it 75-25? Is it 25-75? I don't think that there has been work on that front. Now, for those of us who have been trying to apply evolutionary accounts to management, there's also this wonderful paper by Rob Bergelman already in 1991, who made the point that, of course, you could also conceptualize the firm as an evolving population. And what you need to do in this case, you need to then conceptualize the firm as a population. I here just laid out the firm as having three different characters, and there are three different instantiation of these characters. You can think about the three different routine systems, or you can think about them as three different types of business units within the firm, and then how many people are in these business-to-business units. And then you got to have some sort of selection filter. Now, in this case, Bob Bergelman, in this account of how Intel transformed itself, it turned out there was an internal capital allocation rule which transformed the firm, where essentially those projects which had a higher return on capital got more funds, and those projects which had a low one or a negative one got starved of capital. And so over time, you can then get a firm as a population of different things transform itself again through a selection process without anyone. So the beautiful part of Rob Bergelman's story is Intel didn't actually realize that that is what was transforming their company. They simply had a capital allocation rule. And so for the longest time, they were referring to themselves still as a memory chip company, although memory chips had been starved for capital for a long time, and they were selling integrated circuits. But it took top management quite a while to actually then essentially change how it talked about what the company was actually doing, because this selection process within the firm had transformed the firm without everybody necessarily realizing it, or without intending this to happen. Now I want to move to my third part, namely giving you a lot of evidence that VSR processes and not the superhero versions of CEOs successfully transforming their organizations through an adaptation process lie behind industrial change. Now, I want to start out with some data from Leslie Hanna, who looked at the top 100 firms in 1912, and then you look at how many have survived until 1994. It's 52 survived, but only 19% had remained in the top 100. But I want you to focus for the moment on the 52 as the survival percentage, because I'm going to show you data from other industries. Here's some data that I collected with some Finnish colleagues. We looked at paper mills and looked at how many of the firms that had a paper mill in 1910 still exist in 2000, 90 years later. And the data is compelling in favor of a selection argument. In Finland, it was 9.8%. The highest survival rate is 12%. In Germany, it's only 6%. So again, that means most of the firms have died, and the change at the population level has been accomplished to a large extent through a selection process. With Sekou Bermis, we studied the New York advertising industry. Why New York and why not the entire US? Because New York was the capital of it. And we looked at what companies are in existence in 1926. So what advertising agencies, and then we looked 70 years into the future, and then we only had 87% of them died. So only 13% still surviving. Steve Klepper, who has been one of my other major inspirations, because I think he did very, very good work where he not only collected data on these firms, but the data was also based on a deep qualitative understanding of the industry. And so here is data on the US auto industry. We see in gray the number of firms participating in a given year. And you see the industry starts in 1895. And then the peak number of firms over 250 is reached around 1910. And then this collapse. So Steve Klepper documented this sort of finding in a number of industries. There's also Hannon and Freeman, which showed this collapse of the number of firms in various industries. And so this is, at least when I started to do my work, this was the finding in many industries. Then, as some of you know, I've done work on the synthetic dye industry, and I know, Brian, you have that book on your bookshelf because you showed it to me earlier today. And what I tried to do in this book was to explain success through a selection logic. And I very consciously, right, tried to build on Donald Campbell's work. And I was really inspired, aside from Nelson Winter, Donald Campbell is one of my big heroes. So as you all know, so I'm not going to go into much details. So to make a compelling evolution argument, you need a mechanism for introducing variation. You need a consistent, and this is, by the way, important, consistent selection process, and you need a mechanism for preserving and for propagating selected variants. And I also want to share with you the second idea. I don't know how much you know this one here, but Campbell also wrote about source of success, and he says, the variation selection retention model unequivocally implies that ceteris paribus, the greater the heterogeneity, and the volume of trials, the greater the chance of a productive innovation. Unconventionality and no doubt numerosity are necessary, if not sufficient condition of creativity. And so I was really inspired by this, and I wanted to see, can I show that the success of firms and the success of a national industry is based on this large number of trials and a heterogeneity of trials. And so in the industry, 5 years after the beginning, French in purple and British firms in green are leading with 50% and 40% market share. You see here, the Germans and the Swiss have a small market share. And in 1873, this is 11 years later, Germany has 50% market share. France and Britain are reduced to less than 20%, and Switzerland has almost as large a market share as France and Britain. And given the much smaller size and population by Switzerland, this is on a per capita basis at the same success level as Germany. And then Germany dominates this industry for the next 30 years, and this is what I try to explain in the book. And so what I did together with a historian of technology, Ernst Homburg from University of Maastricht, we created a data set on all the firms that ever existed in making synthetic dyes all over the world. And what I quickly wanted to show you, and this was really, I was very excited when I could show this to Steve Klepper. So this traditional pattern that he saw, namely quick rise of firms and decline of firms, this is seen in France, but if you actually start comparing it across countries, you see that the evolutionary patterns are quite different. So the highest number of firms is only reached in Germany in 1891, and then it goes down a little bit, but it does not collapse as dramatically as is the case in France and in the auto studies that Steve Klepper has presented before. And of course, then we can, look at failure rates. So in case, consistent with Donald Campbell's hypothesis that success is based on large number of trials, we see here the number of entries in Germany is 118. The number of exits by 1914 is 94. So we have a failure rate of 80%. And the failure rate is 80% and higher, except for the United States, where it's only 64. But the Campbell dictum of larger number of trials will lead to more success is clearly supported here. Germany dominated this industry for 30 years after 1881. And so this is first evidence. I also wanted to quickly telescope into a firm. So here is the Bayer company. Bayer was not the first company to do formal R&D. This was actually BASF. Bayer was a little late, but then they started this. And here we have Bayer in 1906. It has 130 research chemists. Organic chemists understood that there are billions of theoretically possible molecules that could have a coloring property. In 1906, Bayer's 130 R&D chemists synthesized 2,656 new dye molecules. They tested on a larger scale after screening them for desirable properties. They tested on a larger scale 60, and only 36 were introduced into the market. So if you will, there is a variation selection retention process within the R&D lab as well. And, highlighting what a number of people, of course, in evolutionary theory have highlighted for decades, right? That we got to conceptualize evolution as a hierarchy, a nested hierarchy of VSR processes. Now, I applied this argument, or I applied evolutionary arguments also to universities as an institution. And so my book title was The Coevolution of National Firms and Institutions. And from my point of view, evolutionary arguments work really well in an industrial setting where you have profit as a clear, consistent selection criteria. I think it's a lot harder, and we can debate this later, to develop compelling VSR accounts of institutional change than for industries. And so in the book, I talked about the university system, and I will show you later on what I did more systematically. But, in terms of university systems, so, well, what are actually the stable selection criteria that we would use to make a compelling VSR argument? Because without stable selection criteria, you cannot make this argument. So in industry, we have profits. What would it be here? The second challenge that I think we have is, well, what is the unit of selection? Is it entire universities? Is it the contest focus of professors? You look at, are there more professorships in organic chemistry versus general physical chemistry, or more over time, less in the humanities and more in sciences? Is it a content of ideas? I think this is all up for grabs, and I want to show you what I did in a subsequent paper where, for a journal publication in journal, you got to be much more parsimonious in terms of what data you can marshal. And so I wrote a book on the coevolution of academic industries of industries and academic disciplines, and I tried to do this across 5 countries. In my book, I covered 3 countries. And the argument I'm trying to make is that if you really want to talk about coevolution in a strict sense, clearly, as we all know, that if you have firms adapting to an environment, that's not coevolution, this is just evolution. So if you really want to talk about coevolution, you would in fact have to have a bidirectional causal mechanism that link the fate of 2 social spheres. So in this case, what I determined, or through inductive research, I found out in 2 ways how the academic disciplines were connected and the industry were connected through, on the one hand, exchange of personnel. We all know about students going to industry, but it turns out there's actually quite a bit of movement that was back from people who worked in industries and later were appointed professors, commercial ties between industries and the academics, and also lobbying on each other on behalf of each other. So my definition of coevolution is 2 evolving population co-evolve if and only if they have a significant causal impact on each other's evolutionary trajectory. And so the formal requirements for a co-evolutionary explanation, from my point of view, are you gotta first identify at least 2 populations that change to a significant degree through a VSR process. And in this case, the population 1 here is the firms differing the blueprints for action. So that is not novel. And then secondly, population 2, I chose because the only data that I could marshal systematically across decades and across different countries was data on publications. And so I'm using here as the second population scientific ideas. And my inspiration on this was Steve Tolman, who developed an evolutionary theory about scientific change. And so, of course, ideas differ in their content. So the second step in the analysis, I need to identify causal mechanisms linking the population of industries, representing industries, to population of scientific ideas, representing disciplines, and the other way around. And in terms of the specific evolution arguments, so we have here variation, selection, attention on the industry level. In the industry, variation can be the entrepreneurs or firm members developing new action patterns. Selection, profitable firms grow, unprofitable firms die. Retention blueprints for action are stored in organizational rules or individual memory. Of course, there are other retention mechanisms that I'm left out here. So in terms of cognitive change in the organization of universities, to just give you a similar stylistic example of this. So university, of course, started in humanities. In Bologna, I also understand that in the next thing they introduced was law. Later on, we had medicine, and even a bit later than medicine, we had organic chemistry. So again, we can have the stylized representation. So we have a population of time t0. It's only to a large extent humanities professorships and humanities ideas in the published literature, a little bit law, a little bit medicine, no organic chemistry. And then we have a selection filter for these ideas, and the selection filter I'm going to speak about in a bit more in a moment. But so again, a selection filter, some ideas will get selected out and other ideas will get amplified. And so we see, again, a change in the frequency of different ideas in the entire universe of population ideas that are represented by academic disciplines. And of course, we can also do this for individual disciplines. So in my case, what I actually focused on is collecting data on the relative share of ideas that are represented by organic chemistry in the overall chemical literature. So we have the basic distinction between inorganic and organic chemistry. And so over time, again, these ideas can change in terms of their frequency because organic chemistry, is selected in and grows more. So to come back to, so what would be these specific evolution mechanisms in academia? Researchers propose new scientific ideas about a class of phenomena. Productive ideas attract more research and gain influence. So they are selected by researchers, just like I've selected VSR as a productive idea that I wanted to employ in my research. And then retention mechanism would be ideas are stored in individual memory in the shared practice of lab groups and the scientific literature. And so the second step then in this co-evolutionary account is to find out, well, what are actually these causal mechanisms that link the fate of these populations? And so here I have a causal mechanism that links industry with academia, and another one go around. But of course, it could be that the same causal mechanism has a bidirectional causation. So that is not determinable ex ante. So I, through an inductive process, came up with these three bidirectional process: exchange of personnel, commercial ties, and lobbying. And I just want to, for the sake of time, just cover two of them. So lobbying, what is lobbying about in this context of the synthetic dye industry? So industry lobbied for academic chemistry, for the people who did research in those fields, to create more laboratory space for teaching and research, and to create new professorships in organic chemistry, and to reestablish research institutes and fund those research institutes well. Now, academics, in turn, lobbied for patent protection on behalf of the industry. And I'm going to give more details on this in a moment. So lobbying evidence in Germany. So after 1864, the new state-of-the-art labs for chemical teaching were built in Berlin, Munich, and in Bonn. This, of course, dramatically increased how many organic chemists were taught. And this also later on helped the firms to staffed R&D laboratories. No firm had their own chemical research school. They all hired people from universities. Von Hofmann, who came back from Britain, he was the professor of the inventor of this first synthetic dye. So he came back to Germany in 1865 after spending, I think, 20 years in the UK. And then he was appointed in Berlin, and he had 150 students, and he, together with a student, published 899 pieces. So in terms of shaping favorable patent law, now Germany was unified in 1871. The dye industry, because it had beat the French and the British, who had a patent law, they were skeptical of the patent law. And so von Hofmann sat on the commission who wrote the patent law. And in fact, the German dye industry got an exception. So in the case of the dye industry, I think it was Article 2 of the German patent law said this patent law does not apply to chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and food products. In those cases, we can only have process patents. So the dye firms thought that they were strong because they had competition. So they wanted to preserve some competition by only allowing for process patents and not product patents. So the effect of this lobbying is it creates a more favorable selection environment for dye firms in Germany, and it also creates a more favorable selection environment for organic chemistry. So organic chemistry as a field grows in Germany. Now, I also want to give you some evidence of Britain. So here is also the successful British firms also are engaged in lobbying. So but the lobbying is focused on textile printing and the dyeing industry, but not so much. So the textile firms lobby very heavily to get university to focus on textile dyeing, but the support for organic chemistry doesn't go that much up. So then, for example, newly created universities such as Leeds, they focused on teaching research in textile chemistry, but not on so much on organic chemistry for creating new ones. Levenstein lobbies and financially supports the creation of a second chemistry laboratory at Owens College that was not to instruct dyers and printers. And here you can see this, how the dye industry didn't want just to train dyers and printers, but to train graduates for leading positions in the industry, especially dye works. So my argument is the strength of these lobbying campaigns were different. And so you see that, over time, because of this lobbying, we see the German lobby more successfully and the German dye industry become stronger. And now I also want to show you how the share of organic chemistry publication changed over time. So here I have a global share of organic chemistry by country. And you can see the first year that we have, and I first will focus on Germany and France so we can focus on the two. So Germany is a bit weaker than France, having 29% of global market share in organic chemistry. In 1862, this is 5 years after the start of the dye industry, Germany has 38%. In 1877, Germany has 50 to 67%. In France, is down to 15. And as more countries start doing research on this, Germany's shares goes a bit down, but not nearly as much. Germany is still very strong, but the French share has gone down to 12.2%. I'm going to fill out the rest of the data. I'm just going to focus on United States. 3.6%, so although the United States is very big, but in the United States, the firms that are strong in winning the lobbying campaigns is the agricultural lobby. So you get a lot of agricultural chemistry, you get a lot of chemistry for helping with sulfuric acids with heavy chemical producers, but not with organic chemistry. So I want to move on to some other evidence that the VSR processes explain industrial success. And so recently I wrote a paper on explaining how WeChat came to dominate the Chinese instant messaging market. And here you see initially WhatsApp was very strong. WeChat was not that strong, but in 2014, if we look at the market share, WhatsApp had a very small market share, WeChat very strong, and it turns out QQ is also strong, but WeChat and QQ are actually two rival products of the same company. And so the paper was actually focused on trying to explain, how this company became so successful. And I wanted to share with you some data that I collected on entry into the, so this was, again, the data we already saw. So in Germany dynasty, over 60 years, we had 118 entrants and 94 exits. To just give you a sense of the staggering magnitude of entry into the instant messaging app space in China over 1 year, 2012, 2013. So we had 91 incumbents in 2012. We had 60 new entrants that year, just in 1 year. So it's almost like half of the number of entrants in the entire space in Germany over 60 years happened in China in 1 year, and we have 21 exits. So there's a massive amount of entry in the IM sector in China by Chinese firms, most of which fail. And the second finding, again, consistent with what I found in the dynasty earlier, is that there's, again, a multi-level VSR process going on. So in the first level, it's actually within a business unit. This is just WeChat. WeChat, similar to the dye R&D laboratory developing 2,000 dyes, WeChat did many, many different trials before they actually launched a new product. So they did trials with trial users, and you can see how many different versions of just version 6.2 were trial before this was laid over. Then we also have a VSR process within the company. So what was interesting in this sort of case is Tencent had a business instant messenger product before smartphones called QQ. And when QQ couldn't come up with a good smartphone version of it, the top management allowed other research groups in the company to come up with other proposals, other products. So WeChat is one of them. Another one was QQ Address Book. QQ Address Book didn't succeed in this internal selection process. But then, and this was the interesting thing, is WeChat and Mobile QQ were maintained as separate business units to this day, and they're competing in the industry level visa process with many, many other products, including Google Talk, Viber, Google Voice, WhatsApp, etc. And WeChat became the winner in terms of adoption through this massive, in this case here, 3-level VSR process. Okay, in my last segment, I want to talk a little bit about my recent work on foresight. So I highlighted in the beginning that, of course, the big question is, to what extent can we account for well-adapted firms through a managerial logic where managers make changes to the firms? Because they make changes, they're well adapted, and they are remaining in the industry, and to what extent it is birth and death of firms that account for why a population looks different over time. So getting a deeper understanding, to what extent one can have foresight over long periods of time is my way of trying to make some headway in terms of sorting out to what extent it's individual managerial in foresight or a selection process accounting for adaptation over time. And so the big challenge that you face is when you're trying to account for firm performance, to what extent firms did something where they didn't realize that this would lead to success. So there's this old saying which goes around that, when IBM was first asked, how many computers do you sell? The CEO Watson said, well, 3. And of course, there are many more computers being sold than 3 since 1950. So it's an example where, again, the managers didn't have foresight how powerful this technology was going to be. So, and the second question is a sustained competitive advantage of organizations due to the skill or the luck of strategists? And so we need to sort this out. And one of the big inspiration for me is a guy called Michael Maupassant. I think I read this book in 2012. And if you're interested in this question, I highly recommend that you read him. He wrote a book called The Success Equation: Untangling Skill and Luck in Business, Sports, and Investing. And he determined, and we'll show you in a moment how he did this. He says, well, in terms of different activities, there are some which are really pure skill, almost 100% skill: chess, and basketball are among those. Then in activities which are pure luck is roulette, slot machines, there's a little bit skill involved. And here is investing. Investing is also largely luck, but has a tiny bit of skill. Now, how does he go in determining, the relative role of luck versus skill? Well, we can use a procedure called a variance decomposition method. For that, you need large samples. And it starts with the realization that skill essentially is the observed outcome minus luck. Now we can do this in terms of variance. The variance observed is equal to the variance of skill plus the variance of luck. We can now transform this. So the variance of skill then would be the variance of observed and the variance of luck. And then we can essentially come up with a measure of the relative role of skill. And his name is the variance of skill over the variance of observed in the data. Or you can also quantify the relative role of luck, which would be variance of luck over the overall variance observed in the data. And so this is what he does when he comes up with this diagram here. So National Basketball League, the contribution of luck is 12%, in Premier League 31%, all the way to Hockey League where it's 53%. So it's a very precise quantification of the relative role of luck. Now, when you go to an academic conference of strategy professors and you would ask, who is the better strategist, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs? Here is their young versions. We could not arrive at a objective conclusion. So I'll put it in other ways. There would be people in the room who would argue after seeing all the evidence, it's Bill Gates, and other people would argue it's Steve Jobs. We cannot scientifically determine with objective facts who is a better strategist. But I think we can now, and this methodology has been around for about 10 years, we can determine scientifically one part of being a good strategist, namely, one part of this is being a good strategic forecaster, seeing what's going to happen in the future, seeing what other companies are doing. The skill of being a better strategic forecaster or having more foresight, that we can now settle with scientific evidence. And the breakthrough for measuring forecasting skills precisely are so-called forecasting tournaments. And the people really have pushed this to a higher level is Phil Tedlock, a political psychologist, and the then research director of IAPA, the research arm of the CIA, Jason Mahoney. And the CIA funded a massive political forecasting tournament between 2011 and 2015. They did another one later on, but I'm going to report on the first one. They invited 5 academic teams to do forecast and compete against the CIA analysts. What Phil Tedlock did was he wanted to use the wisdom of the crowd, and he recruited a large number of amateur forecasters. So these, I call them amateurs because they were not CIA analysts who did nothing but all day trying to figure out these political forecasts. They made over 1 million predictions, about 40 predictions per forecaster. And Phil Tedlock showed that the 2% of non-experts outperformed the CIA analysts, the experts, by about 20 to 30%. But also a crowd forecast plus an algorithm. The algorithm simply weighted the people who forecasted last year well. They gave them a higher weight, and the people who forecasted poorly give them lower weight. So the crowd forecast, the average forecast of the crowd plus this little algorithm beat also the CIA analysts by 20 to 30%. Now, I've been running forecasting tournaments in the last couple of years in my classes. Here you see a forecasting tournament that I ran in my global strategy class last year. We had one question: will North Korea detonate a nuclear device before the end of December 7th, 2022. Then there is a pharmaceutical question, Brian, that will introduce: will Pfizer overtake Roche in market cap at the end of the day of November 23rd? So I just want to give you some flavors of the question that we want to ask, and everyone has to make a forecast, from 0 to 100%. And what we can now do with this methodology, we can clearly rank the skills of forecasters. Here you see an example of a leaderboard, where here you see number of questions forecast 12. Here this is 12. So the key thing in this is we can clearly rank the skill of forecasters. Why? Because each forecast in a tournament has to predict multiple questions. If you just have one question, the forecaster can just get lucky and be better just based on luck. So with only one question, a throw or a forecaster player who has little expertise can with luck beat a second forecaster player who has a lot of expertise. But with 10 questions, it is very unlikely that a forecaster player who has little expertise will beat a second forecaster who has a lot of expertise. And so this is my way how I've started to try to unpack luck versus skill. And now I'm trying to stop my presentation. 1 second. How do I stop sharing? And now I want to open for discussion. So I'm pretty good in time, 45 minutes. I stuck to it.
That's brilliant, Peter. Thanks so much indeed. It's fantastic and very stimulating. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Electronically, I mean, raise your hand. Brian, see your hand.
That was fascinating. Thank you very much. That's even more interesting to me than to most of the audience, I think, because of the industries you chose and obviously the connections between organic chemistry, the dye industry and the pharmaceutical industry. What I wasn't clear about is, have you made a conclusion or a decision about what is the level of selection in industries, or do you regard it like me as a multi-level selection process?
No, so it's a multi-level selection process. That's what I try to indicate. And if you go, I have not done this graphically in the case of Bayer, but in the case of why WeChat outran WhatsApp and Microsoft, what was the Microsoft product? I forgot what the name was. It's because they ran a massive VSR process in their R&D lab. Then, and that was novel, that I hadn't done this in the dye industry before. So if you're trying to, when I try to understand why WeChat became successful, you had to grapple with the fact that the same firm actually had a rival product called QQ. And what typically happens, so Dick Nelson already wrote a paper, I think in 1959, it says, in the face of uncertainty, what you want to do is you want to have rival teams work on different trajectories to see out what's going to work, right? But typically in that work, after a period of parallel R&D where you figure out what approach is better, you later on fold the teams that didn't succeed, right? And you press on with the one. What was novel to me in that kind of context was they didn't fold the QQ team, say, you're now QQ, you are now reporting to WeChat, right? They are now your masters because they clearly are better in doing this. They maintained within Tencent, the company, two rival groups that had, a similar product. And so what the paper is on, and Brian, I sent you this earlier today, the paper is actually on how they manage competition, how they manage the balance between competition between units within the company and cooperation, and how that balance actually shifted over time. So that's what that paper is. But I'm with you. It is a multi-level, and so in the analysis that I've always had the industry and looked at within the firm to some extent, right? But here, yeah. So I'm very much a multi-level.
Good. So thanks. That's the answer I was looking for. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Willem.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for the talk. I just wanted to follow up on the previous discussion, because one of the things that I've always struggled with in the application of variation selection retention logic to firms and industries relates back to what you were just discussing. In the earlier work, it's all about number of firms, right? So what you were also showing the models is about exits and new entries, and this is about survival of individual firms. But what about different growth rates of firms? What about mergers, acquisitions? And in fact, the example, the Tencent example that you gave, if you would just be counting at the level of number of firms, I think you would be missing what is, in some sense, for strategists, the most interesting part, which is actually the relative competitive success, which is not only survival. So the survival rates and the just counting of firms is very much what the sociologists have always done. Just a number of firms, but there's more going on, and especially relative success rates. One firm that really grows very large. So the multi-level selection thing that you were discussing just now with Brian, I think is quite crucial, and it also relates, and that's the last part of my question. It relates to what is actually being selected. Is it firms? Is it products? Is it some sort of underlying routines? And then if it is products or underlying routines, should we not look at market shares, or should we look at also the copying of routines by other firms? So how do you have you thought about these sorts of issues?
I have, and clearly I want to bring it back to what I opened up with, and because I think this is also connected to what you two are raising, namely, to what extent can I account for the success of the firm through intentional strategies being run by people, right? Because the reason why so if you think about, one can have two views of what you do as a manager, right? One view is to say look, I have no idea what the practices are that will be successful in the future, right? So what I'm doing in large part, in order to avoid getting selected out, by the market, what I do is I establish within the firm evolutionary systems where a lot of things are being tried, but I'm also trying to create selection criteria. So I'm not going to specify. So for instance, if I go back to Tencent, right? Tencent has a very strong culture of people, researchers being able to open up new research groups to work on stuff they think is important to work on, right? So what I've been grappling with is to what extent I can account for, or to what extent the success of the adaptation of the firm comes because of there's in de facto a multi-level selection process in there where the firm, has processes to stimulate variation, right? The firm has, but also some selection criteria, right? And so I conceptualize my task very much of almost like guiding evolution versus you thinking I can actually figure out ex ante, right, where the world is going, and I can just place a bet on one strategy or on one master routine. The other thing that you were asking, and clearly implicit in my work, I have not just today, I focused perhaps a bit on the counting of firms. If you go back, or if I showed you again where the selection diagram animation I had is, the firms also become a lot bigger. And Jan Willem, you're absolutely right. Clearly, what is different from, at least my understanding of biological evolution, right? In biological evolution, the size differences between different horses are not that gigantic, or the size difference between humans. Yeah, we go anywhere, I think maybe between 80 centimeters and whatever, 3 meters, right? But there's no human being that is 100 meters high and no human being that is 1 centimeter high, right? So that is clearly that is different. And one of the big criticisms again, Hannon and Freeman, was initially that they did a lot of work on restaurants and so forth. That are always small, and say, why don't you do it with the big companies? And you're absolutely right. Growth is the growth of individual firms. Is clearly an important thing to be explained. But my study of the dynasty shows is if you don't make money, you don't have the resource to invest and grow and gain market share, right? So there's still the market test that if at the end of the day, the consumers are selecting your products, but at the end of the day, your level of profits is still a crucial selection criteria. So I don't know, Jan Melvin, if I meandered around a little bit, but if in my meandering around I answer to something. Oh, there was also the merger and acquisition question. So in the case of the dye industry, it turned out that when there are mergers, so I didn't talk about this at all today, is Ernst Homburg and I, the historian of technology from the Netherlands, we also created a database of plants. So what often happens, firms go bankrupt, and then in fact the plant is being bought by another firm. So in that case, in the case of the dye industry, we didn't have the examples of what I call the merger of equals. That happens in the German dye industry in the 1920s, where they merge all the firms into one firm called IG Farben in the early 1920s. So in the period that I studied, we didn't have this example of two companies merging who are equally strong, and then it's not clear who do you actually call the failed person. And that's clearly a challenge for studies of industries where, strong firms, or in the case of, you see a lot of mergers when you have overcapacities in industries, right? Then you see firms merging, and in that case, it's not the case that a failed company and a strong company, oftentimes two companies that are not doing that well themselves are merging and one is surviving. So
Thanks.
in summary, I'm with you. Growth and market share are the relevant ones. And in my work, I've always done this, that I actually that I have accounted for that. I just wanted to see, if you go back to the Campbell, I just wanted to see, and I think that was powerful. I think nobody had shown that data before, right? That yes, Germany was dominant, but they also had more trials. So that was powerful evidence in the line of Donald Campbell.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you both. Marion.
You said earlier that you tend to try first the kind of concepts that are used in biological evolutionary theory, and I understand that. I was a bit curious about I loved all your empirical stuff about the dye industry and so on. It was great. I really enjoyed that. But your skill versus luck question, I think a biological evolutionist would just say the luck is sampling error in finite populations, period. And that's essentially, I think, what you came down on in the end when you talked about the number of guesses when they're making a single guess versus many, or a single judgment versus many judgments and so on.
No. So there I was misunderstood. And by the way, I realized that I was going really, really fast. So I took an evolutionary approach. I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you, and then we'll in the discussion we'll go back to the things. Okay.
Okay.
So no. I'm really committed. As an evolutionist, right? I don't need a lot of foresight. I'm perfectly happy with firms just starting and somebody has the right recipe, and that creates, well-adapted firms. But I also recognize that the evidence is overwhelming that firms try to adapt. Okay, and I gave you this example of Smith Corona, and you look at other firms as, for example, there's a big literature on learning curves, right? And if you look at productivity gains, you can see that many, many firms clearly get better at things, right? So to say that firms are not learning and adapting through intentional action is also not true to the evidence. What I'm trying to sort out, if you go back to strategic management, when you stop to reflect about this, and Jan Willem, I'm going to hear what you and Brian have to say about this. When you reflect on this, every strategy is an implicit prediction what you think will be successful in the future. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to measure, and I think we can do this with this forecasting tournament. It's not that one forecaster is making more predictions, the other one is making less predictions. We are just counting. So for instance, I could ask you, how many people do you expect to be present for the next Darwin Club meeting? Okay, right now we have, how many do we have today? But earlier I checked about 15 or something like that, between 15 and 20, right? And I would ask each of you to make a prediction. You get who the speaker will be, and I ask you to make a prediction, okay? Imagine you do this, if you only ran this competition once, it could be somebody had no clue and just guessed something, a number, right? And, a person who has only been at the seminar once guesses, right? And outcompetes all of you who have been coming to each of the seminars and you actually have a better evidence base, right? So I say with one prediction, you could have just gotten lucky, even if you have, or a person with less skills could get lucky and get one question correctly. But if you have better skills in forecasting, if I asked you 10, 20, 30 questions, we can then measure your skillfulness, because 20 or 30 times, if you're just guessing, you are not going to do better than the person who actually knows a little bit about the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think in evolutionary terms, it's a more complicated process, but it does make sense. I think they call it adaptive phenotypic plasticity. The people that had much more experience have many different options to try under different circumstances that they've already evolved.
Yeah. Okay. Well, or to put it in other ways, I don't know, and you, Marion, you know a lot more about biological evolution than I, but I can translate to you what we need. Okay. So in this case, it is whether or not, you're guided, whether or not you actually have insight to guide, to pre-adapt, right? So it's so I don't know to what extent biology has been worrying about pre-adapt, meaning that you can foresee where the environment is going and you pre-adapt for it.
Yeah, the only point is, it's not so much a problem, is that a person that has that kind of foresight acquired it by some selection process in the past. That is, they had that experience, whether it's an individual experience or whatever. That has to have been acquired somehow.
But also, and the person. So it turns out. So Phil Tedlock has actually analyzed it a little bit. What do these people do, right? Who make better forecasts? Okay, it turns out. So in the case of these political contests, which they had, right? These were people who looked at the world through different lenses, right? So they were multi-model thinkers. The people who saw the world through one model didn't do as well. Now, it also turned out, but I'm not sure to what extent that holds up. People who did a little bit of probability training were also better. But the most salient finding that I think is shining through are the people who actually have are able to eliminate noise, meaning all of the information that you shouldn't be paying attention to, which are just distracting you, so they have a better theory of the world. Now, so these are some of the psychological principles, but in terms of the real problem, and Brian, I want you to come in there. Brian, every consultant in the world, every McKinsey of the world, right, is trying to sell the notion, if you listen to my advice, you can become more successful in your strategy, right? And I'm trying to say is, look, as an evolutionist, I'm very skeptical how much skillfulness you can have in this, but I'm open to actually trying to measure how much skillfulness you have. And the methodology is skillfulness in terms of forecasting. That one we can now sort out who is just lucky and who actually has it a bit more skill. This is not about perfect foresight and no foresight. It is incrementally seeing a bit further out than your competition. And that one, and that's the big Nord, this is what I'm focusing on my research right now, is that one we can now measure, and that's what I want to do. With the overall project, Marion, to have more of a sense to what extent skillfulness lies behind survival and growth, right? As opposed to
I understand.
a selection process where the agents know very little.
Thank you.
Roger Koppel's had his hand up for some time, so can I bring Roger in, please, first?
Yes, hi, thanks. Like others, I enjoyed this. It was terrific. And Marion, I think, was right to single out your empirics. I mean, that's just cool. It's just fabulous. I'm struggling on the conceptual issue of skill versus luck.
Okay.
I really don't understand that. I mean, consider like the Wright brothers versus, this Brazilian guy, Alberto Santos Dumont, who, okay. So let's say that the Wright brothers were indeed there first. Is that because of skill or luck? I mean, or rather, did Alberto Santos Dumont lose because of skill or luck? If the Wright brothers hadn't been there, he would have been first. You would say it's all skill, right? But the presence of the Wright brothers, they're not there. So does the presence of the Wright brothers mean that the skill level is lower? So I'm just not grasping what the difference between skill and luck is. And if I may just slightly elaborate,
sure.
Part of it seems to be in your head the idea of one's theory of the world. But if we live in a non-ergodic system where theories are always approximations that endure, that serve as approximations only for a short time, then I don't even know what's a better theory. Thank you.
Okay, Peter.
Okay, yeah, all right. So, Roger, you are pinpointing that the disentanglement of luck versus skill is actually not trivial. I perhaps made it sound a little bit more trivial than it is. And to stick with your example, if I was going to make the argument, okay, let's say is a strategic management scholar who believes that we can actually teach people to be better strategists and believes in superhero CEOs who sat in his or her class, right, might say, yeah, there's an obvious answer why the Wright brothers succeeded, because they had more skill. That is the answer to this question. Now, then, when you look and study this empirically, right, now, if it turns out the Wright, we would have to look at the timing. The second person that you mentioned, I don't know. Is this person doing it at the same time as the Wright brothers?
Yeah. The same general time. I think his first recorded and acknowledged and recognized heavier than air flight above some minimal distance that was then operative as the standard might have been about a year later. So that's why I think probably the Wright brothers get credit for being first. But everybody was there competing at the same time. You could see it. Just put an airfoil together with some kind of propeller and light gas engine, and you're going to have it. And it was, the race was on. Those were just two of the races.
So let me give you a different context where I can explain this well. I am a tennis player, okay? And I'm actually playing in a league here. If you would pair me up against Roger Federer, and if we only played one ball, right? It is conceivable that through luck, and the match is over after one ball. We only play one ball. Whoever wins is one ball. it's conceivable that with luck, the wind just starts blowing, right? And the ball rolls in a way, and I beat Roger Federer with luck. Now, if the game goes on 5 sets, I can assure you that every single time Roger Federer is going to walk off the court as a winner because his skill level is so much higher level than me. And so where I'm going with this is, and this is where the strangeness or the challenge comes. When you have Roger Federer at the height of his game play against Nadal, the skill levels are so similar that in fact that individual match is decided in large part through luck that day. But
yeah,
nonetheless, yeah.
You know, that's sort of you know, yes, I mean, I think we all recognize that, but I'm still perplexed.
Yeah.
If we, because you're invoking a notion of repeated trials, but in a non-ergodic world, there are no repeated trials. That's where my conceptual confusion arises. I wonder if it's conceptually correct to distinguish between luck and skill, conceptually, in a world without repeated trials, in a world in which repeated trials cannot happen because it's not ergodic.
Okay, so let me ask you the following question, and I'm trying to translate this into my framework. If the environment at time t0 and the environment at time t1 are completely different, and there is a random process, because in a thought experiment, right, we can say the connection between time t0 and time t1 of the environments, they are completely random because we are setting up an artificial selection regime. And there is no way that you could actually know anything about, even though you may have been successful at time t0 in whatever you did, there is no way that you could be successful because we randomly, create the environment at time t0. So there cannot be a skillfulness in this world. So are you saying to me you're confused how I can speak about skillfulness in a world where the universe from time t0 to time t1 is transformed in a random way? So there is no way how you could actually know anything about the future.
Well, that universe that you're describing, in which between any t sub I and t sub I plus 1, there's no connection. It's random. That's an ergodic universe. We live in a non-ergodic universe. So, I guess in the ergodic universe, the hyper-random ergodic universe you describe, yes, I suppose it's all luck and no skill. There's no opportunity for skill to be acquired. But that's not the world we live. That's not the world I was invoking. I was invoking a non-ergodic world, an evolutionary world. So I don't really know how to work the concept of luck in.
No, at least the way
something like that, luck.
Okay, so the way I work this in is when I look at, maybe we go to an arena which all of us know, right? If you looked at citations to different scholars, okay? And we paired people up who started their careers who are roughly the same age, right? And say we are also roughly in the same domain, okay? And then you find out that there is, one scholar has 10,000 sites and another one has 1,000, right? And now we ask the question, to what extent the 10,000 is explained by the person having 10 times as much skill as the first person. And I think we know in this sort of world, right, that who gets cited first, who is cited by a couple other people, that can lead to a cascade of things where you wouldn't make the argument that the person who has 10,000 sites has 10 times more skills as a scholar as the person with 1,000 sites. So Roger, I have a hard time understanding why you have a problem with that outcomes can be a combination of luck and skill. And our task is to try to tease this apart.
I have any number of time. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeff. Excuse me.
Yeah, we are getting to the end of time.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a question, and Brian also. And can
Okay.
I suggest that I quickly ask my question, and
Sure.
then I hand over to Brian, and then you can have whatever's left, Peter, to sum up. We'll look forward to that. On the chat, I've raised some conceptual issues. I won't go into them now. There's different kinds of selection, and there's the difference between objects and outcomes of selection. All your models, all your diagrams had one kind of selection, which is called subset selection. This comes back to George Price, which we've explored, but I mean, I haven't got time to go into that now.
Okay.
I've got a simple question, Peter. You mentioned VSR. Your whole argument is constructed about VSR. You've mentioned it a lot in your work.
Yeah.
Why don't you mention Darwin more often? Because he invented it.
Okay.
Brian.
Right. So it's not so much a question as to try to respond, because Peter, asked me to. I think to some extent this idea of the hero CEO is a straw man. I mean, I know that I can go to any airport bookshop and see books full of hero CEO bullshit, but
Okay.
let's just say, but you raised the point that what consultants say effectively is success depends upon placing the right bet. We will tell you what bet to take, and implying that the consultant is capable of making a better bet. Okay.
Yes.
That is how some consultancy works, but within this constructive consultancy, of course, there are those that enable the company to make the decisions as opposed to making the decisions for them. And among that subset, I would argue that most of them would say that success is not the function of simply placing the right bet, but of having the right sort of capabilities. Now, those capabilities are aggregates of organizational routines. They're in the same way that in my work, I talk about a firm having a capabiliome that is analogous to the proteome that is expressed by the genome. And among the critical routines there, excuse me, my fault. Among the, is the capability to understand the market environment better than your rivals.
Yeah.
That enables the capability to generate more ideas than your rivals, which is what Campbell was talking about. But I think what's critical there is this ability of the leadership, not necessarily the hero CEO, but the leadership to select from those ideas. Okay. Ones that are most likely to fit the external environment, because what works is whether what you do fits the external environment. It's the environmental fit that leads to success. And then of course there's another necessary routine, the ability to execute the strategy, because the strategy you decide isn't necessarily the strategy that happens, and that includes adapting to unforeseen events and things in the luck thing. So there's a whole set of routines that add up to capabilities that effectively express themselves in the organization's phenotype. And that's what leads to success. To say that simply betting on a strategy is the key to the future is a simplification, and I'm pretty sure you know that, of course.
No, but Brian, that is clearly what is happening if you give a 45-minute talk and you cover a lot of terrain, right?
I understand that completely, Peter. Yes.
Yeah. So Brian, that's absolutely not my view. But I want to take it back, and maybe this is maybe I can also answer to Jeff. Jeff, the reason why I'm not doing Darwin, if I ask myself honestly, right, who has, I'm not sure, if I have ever read Darwin's Origin of Species, every single word. I recently looked at it again, but I couldn't tell you that I read. But Donald Campbell, the key articles, I have read and reread every one of them, and he is, it's although I was Richard Nelson's students, the person who really converted me to this is Donald Campbell. Okay. And I find, and Jeff, of course, and you also, right? If you go back, the beauty of the 1974, where he showed this VSR process in all domains, right? I mean, that to me is on that was mind-boggling. That is what that's the personal reason why I want to give credit to Donald Campbell, because he's the one who made me see things.
He gave credit to Darwin.
And that's why I'm also here. That's why I'm talking to Darwin Club, because clearly I recognize the connection. But you asked me why.
Yeah, I mean, he saw the origination of those ideas in Darwin.
Yeah. So
and gave full credit to him.
Yeah. I'm here. That's why I'm giving credit by speaking to the Darwin Club, right?
Great.
Brian. So Brian, if I have 2 minutes, and I realize this is. I want to abstract this, now if we go back, right, why was Darwin so revolutionary? And what is the worldview that Darwin tried to counter, right? The alternative is actually a view of the universe where not a superhero CEO, but an all-knowing God is actually responsible for all of the beautifully designed things in the world. And so where I am coming from is ask this question: to what extent can we explain the beautifully designed structures by invoking a super mind? And maybe it's, the consultant who helps the firm figure it out, but still there are people who understand everything. And then we explain success through understanding everything, or through a logic where saying, look, you are placing out strategies are hypotheses, some of them better and some of them worse informed, right? And whether or not the strategy will work depends a great deal on an environment that you never fully understand. So I am, I want to tease apart to what extent successful action is because of deeper insights, or because no, there was a selection process going on where, with relatively limited amount of insight and knowledge, you can still have successful firms coming out of that. So that to me is the overall project. And clearly I want to help determine, but there's some insight. But I want to also point in Brian, maybe this is where you are going, is how do we actually set up what I call a system where we are trying to make firms a little better, but also we are humble, and we realize, and this is why I wanted to, and those of you who have never read it, read the Smith-Corona story. Because the Smith-Corona stories, they tried so much, they did so many things, they tried to build new capabilities, but it was still not enough to survive.
And I've just one very quick comment to close over, Major. I'm obviously pretty much in violent agreement there, Peter, but what I find fascinating, and I think Robin's left the call now, but in the same way that human beings appear to have this, from my perspective, weird affection for religion, an all-powerful God.
Yeah.
It seems to me to be a similar trait that leads to their passion for hero CEO stories in airport bookshops.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want, as a strategic management scholar, I want to be intellectually honest. Say I can explain success by very little insight. Clearly there's some, but I would want to push us to be intellectually honest, and with 1 minute less, because what it also does is, and here then, we also need to have more empathy for the gigantically difficult task that CEOs truly face. So this is maybe what I want to end up is, I actually want to, through what I'm doing, I'm also trying to build empathy among scholars and among the larger public that this is really a hard job because it's very difficult to actually know where the world is going. Everything is so complex that we need to recognize that just because somebody is not winning or having a growing firm doesn't mean the person is stupid or didn't try their best.
Peter, that's fantastic. Really stimulating. Excellent illustration of where these principles can be applied with a fruitful discussion and intellectual progress. So thanks very much indeed. We'll do a virtual clap.
And
to
thanks
Peter
everybody for coming this afternoon and hearing me
You're very
out.
welcome. So on that note, after thanking Peter, thank you very much for attending this seminar. The next one is in a few weeks' time, and we've got a whole program more or less 1 a month into the autumn. So you'll be very welcome to come to those too. So good morning or good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for coming. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye.